Welcome to the Rome Center for Political Philosophy. Benvenuti. I'm David Levy, and we're going to be talking today with Jonathan Marks, chair of the Department of Politics at Ursinus College near Philadelphia. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me. Once you told me that the Rome Center is the gateway to becoming a rock star in Italy, I couldn't say no.
You're right.
It is Ursinus College. I feel my dean breathing down my neck.
Before we started, I asked you how to pronounce the name, and I still got it wrong. So thank you for correcting me. Professor.
Always teaching, yeah.
Jonathan Marks is the author of a book on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is the co-editor of a book on principle and prudence. He's also the author of numerous articles on political philosophy, as well as on higher education. And today we'll be talking about his book, Let's Be Reasonable, a conservative case for liberal education, which was published last year by Princeton University Press. Jonathan, the term liberal education, many of our viewers are likely to be Italian, and the term liberal education is likely to be less familiar to Italians than to Americans. So for the benefit of all of us, and especially of our Italian audience, could you say something about the meaning of liberal education as you understand it? How is liberal education different from education that is not liberal? What does the word liberal mean here?
Thank you. Well, the term was, I think, born in Rome. So you can find explanations of it in Cicero, where it means something like the education befitting a free person, which has two branches. One's political. So how do I become a citizen of a free polity? And one is trans-political. What's needed to be free simply? And that may require appealing beyond the authority of even a more or less free state. In the United States, I'd say that we try to run these two meanings together. Thomas Jefferson, in his last public letter, said something like the right to the free, unbounded exercise of reason would tend to support the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And so, in a way, liberal education to be the citizen of a free republic and liberal education to be free simply came down to the same thing. So liberal means in this context free. What that means for Cicero is one thing. Liberal education requires freedom from slavish occupations, which I suppose for him would mean a lot of what we now call work. For us, liberal education still requires leisure, right? It still carries that meaning of it's not just vocational, it's not just professional or pre-professional, but it is for non-aristocrats. Now, what does that look like? In other words, if we were looking at liberal education in action, how would that look? My argument goes back to John Locke in the 17th century. And one significant way in which our freedom is limited is by our narrowness. He says we see but in part and we know but in part, and therefore it's no wonder we conclude not right from our partial views. Overcoming that narrowness requires what he calls comprehensive enlargement of mind. And That comes, and more Locke quotations incoming, from listening to the opposite arguings of men of parts, showing the different sides of things, even attending to those who we think come short of us in capacity because their experience might correct ours. It means recognizing the limits of the sciences that we study and are familiar with, the books that we like to read, the ways of knowing and modes of analysis with which we're most familiar. It entails the study of old books because part of our narrowness is the narrowness of time. It requires, if you can swing it, travel, because part of our narrowness is the narrowness of place. And here, many of the elements of what we'd call a liberal arts education emerge from reflection on some of the many obstacles to becoming reasonable. That idea that we have to look at this subject area and that subject area and look at the humanities and the social sciences and the natural sciences, that tends to emerge from reflection on our narrowness.
All right, so liberal education has to do with making us free in either a political or a trans-political sense. And you cite John Locke, who, among other things, is a political philosopher. Could you say a little bit more about the connection between liberal education and political philosophy? You are a scholar of political philosophy. Is education a central theme of political philosophy as you understand it? Or is it just, did you write a book about liberal education just because you happen to be interested in liberal education?
Yeah, I think it is a perennial theme of political philosophy, and probably an essential theme if political philosophy is the attempt to get at the truth about the good society and about the best way of life. Getting at that truth would seem to require some liberation from the reigning opinions of those things that exist in any given time and place. And what liberal education, in at least its trans-political sense, suggests that it wants to provide is precisely that kind of liberation. All kinds of people write about liberal education. The last books I've read, I think one was by a professor of American Studies, one by a law professor, one by somebody who was trained in philosophy, but not political philosophy in particular. But still, I do think it's, again, an essential theme and certainly a perennial theme, going all the way back, I think, in some ways to Plato, where a question that arises in the dialogues is, what role can inquiry play in our political life? And in some ways, you see some questioning of the possibility of liberal education as we now conceive it there, I think. That is to say that professors say, you might say, people complain, about the state of higher education, how professors are beleaguered, but somehow they did manage to turn the trick of getting people to pay them for pursuing these inquiries rather than killing them. That's something new. And I think the earlier treatments of education and political philosophy would have wondered whether that was possible or desirable.
All right. Now, why your book in particular? Why do we need today an explanation and a defense of liberal education, and in particular the one that you give.
Yeah, I remember in an earlier instantiation of the book, I think I might have said something like anything worth saying is worth saying more than once. That is to say that I didn't set out to write something really novel here. I think that liberal education always requires an explanation and a defense. One comic or not so comic feature of reading in the history of education and political philosophy is that one always thinks that people who pose as being educated, who have gone through whatever passes for education at the time, are in truth not really educated. That's something that Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who disagreed about so much, agree about, that the learned of their time are not, in fact, learned. I'm not sure that our time is so much worse than any other time from the standpoint of liberal education or the need for a defense. Even so, one reason that new defenses are required are because circumstances do change. And at least in the United States, liberal education has to make its way against two different forces united in their presentism, the sense that education ought to provide for certain immediate needs. So on the left, I'd say, and particularly from within the university, liberal education faces the objection, why are you dithering about your narrowness and the limits of your knowledge? We've got revolutionary work to do right now, pronto. That needs to get done. And then in the middle, I'd say, I wouldn't call this a right-wing idea per se. The worry is, why are you dithering about the limits of your knowledge or even about freedom itself? You're going to have to learn to manage a spreadsheet if you're going to get a job when you get out. And the corporation really doesn't want to train you, so education should be training to get you a job pronto. So both those forces say that we need to do something to deal with our immediate needs. We kind of know what we need already, so we'd have to dither very much about the limits of our knowledge. And then on the right, which, for many, many, many decades hasn't been especially friendly to higher education. I think that patience with higher education has really gotten even thinner than it has been in most of my lifetime anyway. When I was coming into college, that was a long time ago, in 1987, a very popular book among conservatives, self-described conservatives, was Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, which was a defense of liberal education. And many conservatives during that period would have said, well, that's what we want, do that. Today, whether out of frustration, the sense that simply hasn't happened despite one's best efforts over the past 3+ decades, or instead, because of the view that really there was something suspicious about the idea of liberal education from the very beginning, that might be a Trojan horse for anti-conservative thinking. Conservatives are even less inclined to think in terms of educational reform than they were then, and more inclined to think of the university as an enemy asset that has to be weakened or destroyed. And so I think the going motto, at least among American conservatives, is starve it. Finally, and I don't want to be too long-winded about this, the institutional supporters of liberal education, I think, are not great at defending it. In the United States, that would probably be the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They have a journal called Liberal Education. They assert that they're all for liberal education. But if you look at the bland communiques they issue from time to time about liberal education, it's a strange combination of, this will be really useful to help you get a job because we've got skills, skills, skills. This is really going to help us achieve social justice. Or here's some rubrics to help you measure whether you're making progress in liberal education. I'd say that's their triad right there. And I'm not sure that much of that has much to do with liberal education as I've just described it. So I think there's a bit of a gap there.
So I gather from your answer that, in your view, liberal education is not a training for revolutionizing society, although you did mention earlier that it may very well concern thinking about what is the good society. So it doesn't ignore that question, but you're arguing that it's not about, liberal education is not about making a revolution, or maybe it's not even about maybe reforming society, at least in the first place. Secondly, it's not about acquiring useful skills, useful vocational skills. And you also think that you also dissent, although you describe yourself as a conservative, you dissent from the conservative view that the universities are controlled by the left and therefore don't deserve our support. You are a supporter of the university, a qualified supporter of the university.
Yes.
Although or because you're a conservative. What kind of a conservative are you?
I'm laughing because a number of conservatives raised precisely that question, a more hostile tone, in response to my book. So one odd feature, I think, of American conservatism, until only yesterday, was that what it claimed it wished to conserve was the principles of a revolution, the American Revolution, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that governments are instituted by consent to secure natural rights. And to tie it to the theme of the book, those principles placed a high premium on reason because, as I noted before, from Jefferson's perspective, the main drafter of the Declaration of Independence, the free, unbounded exercise of reason would tend to support those principles. They were uncommonly capable of withstanding scrutiny, even of growing stronger under scrutiny. At the same time, a lot is expected of citizens in a polity where consent is the standard and where somehow or another we have to know whether the government is instituting some design to tyrannize over us. So that's one side of things. And I'd say I regard myself as conservative in that sense and thinking of those principles as valuable and worth preserving. But there's another strain of conservatism, not merely American, which has some suspicion of the capacity of reason to triumph in our world. And some doubts too, I think, about the capacity of reason to produce unqualified, universal solutions to human problems. So in that way, it cuts to some extent against the idea of the Declaration as a universal kind of teaching. I at least suppose that the extent to which reason can govern human affairs is limited, and that the capacity of, the obstacles to becoming reasonable, both individually and collectively, are formidable, and that consequently, even carving out a space for reason is going to be a great challenge. So I'd say that sort of uneasy relationship between support for, let's call it the American Enlightenment, right, on the one hand, and then some suspicion or worry about the capacity of reason to triumph in the world, and our capacity to be as reasonable as we need to be in a way in order to support such a regime. Those two things in some tension with each other put together, I think, would characterize my conservatism, which I think also characterizes a group that we call neoconservatives in the US.
Well, just parenthetically, I think some people at least accuse neoconservatives of being much more hopeful about the power of universal principles in the world, especially in the world outside of the Western democracies, than you seem to, much greater confidence than you seem to have. If you're saying you're a little bit skeptical, as I understand it, you're saying you're a supporter of the Enlightenment principles on which the United States was founded, but you take a somewhat sober or moderate view of the capacity of those principles to make the world rational.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And if I want to briefly respond to what you said about the neoconservatives, especially, I'd say though not only, especially because of the Iraq War, neoconservatism has really become associated with a particular foreign policy position.
Yes.
It always had a foreign policy wing, but the ideas go back a long way, well before the Iraq War, to people like Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, and they really drew, in a lot of ways, on the 19th century political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who I think taught them that democracy, including liberal democracy, might require support from, for example, religion. It might require certain virtues that needed to be taught. And in both of those cases, I think the understanding was something to the extent of, liberal democratic institutions aren't going to, even if you set up the institutions pretty well, right? You've got markets that channel somehow rights-bearing and self-interested individuals to produce the common good, even if they don't really care about it. and you've got a political system of checks and balances set up so that the ambition of public officials, even if they don't care that much about the common good, will somehow produce desirable political results. I think the neoconservatives tended to think that won't quite work. And you need support from, again, virtues, which required in education, religion, and so on. Now, you might think, and I think it's fair to say, that because the character of those supports, that they would tend to differ from locality to locality, from country to country, so that you couldn't quite take, right, an American model and simply, right, impose it all over the world. Even if you think that the fundamental principles, right, the idea of natural rights, that's universal, you might nonetheless understand that the idea of just taking that model and trying to impose it across the world, that you'd run into some serious obstacles if you attempted to do that.
So freedom and rationality for the neoconservatives require not merely correct institutional design, but maybe even more so certain qualities of character, certain customs, manners, and morals.
Yes.
And that's what you mean by neoconservatism.
Well, I don't know if it's all of what I mean by neoconservatism, but yes, that's a key element to my mind of what counts as neoconservatism. So
back to reason, and let's be reasonable is the title of your book, which is it's an exhortation, which implies that we aren't always very reasonable. Maybe, as you know, if one reads your book, one has the impression that, in your view, we're rarely reasonable in the full sense of that term. Could you say a little bit more about why? It seems to be your view that the formation of reasonable people is the highest goal of liberal education. Could you say a little bit about what that means to be reasonable in your sense, and why is it so difficult? Why do we need a full-scale liberal education to become reasonable? Isn't just, ordinary good sense, common sense, as we say, isn't that enough?
Well, you don't get out enough, David.
Lately, I have not been getting out very much. It's true.
Let me take the questions reverse order, and I'll draw on although I feel it's important to mention that my book is not about John Locke. Nonetheless, I want to draw on him again. So Locke's Of the Conduct of the Understanding is something like a compendium of the various ways in which the mind can go wrong, like some branches of psychology today. And I'm not going to try to name them all, because there are a lot of such ways. But some are quite deep-seated. So in part because we've built on them, in part out of habit, in part because we love what's familiar to us, what's closest to us, we are deeply attached to prejudices grounded in education, in fashion, in party, interest, and so on. Now, it's true, according to Locke, and this seems right to me, I've had some experience this in teaching, that we do get distressed when we notice that we can't defend our most cherished opinions when we're asked why we have them or hold them. And that does open the door a crack for trying to set those opinions on a rational foundation. And if we fail to do that, then revising our opinions. but precisely because we get so alarmed when the opinions on which we depend to make sense of our lives prove hard to defend, we're actually in rather a rush to place them on some kind of foundation. And so we'll take what's ready to hand, or if people let us do it, right, when Tuesday we're presented with an argument against the opinion, we're very distressed, right? On Wednesday, we might go back to it, right, if the person refuting it isn't still around to be in our face. So there's openness to trying to be reasonable there, but at the same time, there's resistance, for the reasons I've named. And what that means, to go to the first part of your question, is that reason isn't, though it has something to do with this, just a set of skills. When we say be reasonable, right, there, by the way, there's a bit more of a confrontation element to it. Let's be reasonable. We say be reasonable, we're probably grabbing somebody by the lapels. And what we mean is something like, come on, let's stop boosting our tribe. Let's stop trying to sell our wares. Let's stop puffing ourselves up. Let's get serious and try to understand what valid conclusions we can draw from what we know. And if we can't draw such conclusions, what we need to know in order to be in a position to do that. So that let's be reasonable becomes a kind of exhortation. Locke says, and this is the quote that I open the book with, there cannot be anything so misbecoming, unfit for. There cannot be anything so misbecoming anyone who pretends to be a rational creature as not to yield to plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments. And in that statement, implicitly, is a sense of honor and dishonor that goes beyond skills and supports reason in its fragility. Lots of people have skills, right? Bullshitters often are highly skilled at reasoning. Hired guns, who appear on TV to support the party line, are often very skilled reasoners. Your social media frenemy is quite often a very skilled reasoner, at least when she's analyzing your argument. But what's not there is any appetite for analyzing or raising questions about one's own argument, of treating reason as an authority for oneself, as opposed to a club with which to beat others about the head.
Let's suppose that liberal education can help us become reasonable, or at least less unreasonable than we normally are. Let's not be too ambitious. What are we supposed to be reasoning about exactly?
Well, so I think that we start with something not all that rarefied, not necessarily the stuff of an advanced philosophy seminar. We start with what is important, urgent, interesting for us individually. Often that has something to do with what the consensus is about what's interesting, important, urgent, valuable, right? We start with that, presumably. And in the course of reasoning about those things, though, we may find ourselves revising our estimate of what's important, what's worth looking into. So, we want what's good, whatever that means. We spend, I think, a lot of our time trying to reason about that, but our conception of what's good can change as we start to reason about what we want. We may find, well, that's actually a dead end, and maybe something else makes more sense. Or I thought what I wanted was this, but then I got it, and it doesn't seem like what I wanted after all. And so you start to think about, well, what is the object of this longing that I have? So I think that, sorry, it's telling me I'm muted, but I don't seem to be muted on my end.
I think you're okay now.
Okay, thank you. So
It was my mistake.
Okay, so you're hearing me all right then?
Yes.
Yeah? All right, we can put that in the bloopers reel.
We'll do that.
Very important when you've got a great show to have a bloopers reel. So, I think that, one of the things I really like about, it really seems like we're trying to form a Locke fan club, right? But one of the things I really like about Locke's treatment of this matter is that liberal education as devoted to the cultivation of reason is something that the soul devoted to truth does. And that's sort of, you might say, a special kind of soul. How many souls are genuinely dedicated to truth? But it's also, our understanding, our reason, that's the last recourse we've got, Locke says, in the conduct of ourselves, in every important matter. So, to circle back, we start by reasoning about what we take to be good or interesting, but in the course of that reasoning, our aims might end up changing. We might end up revising those aims under the pressure, you might say, of reasoning about them.
All right, now let's look at a possible objection to this argument that you mentioned. We start from what's urgent and important, and one of the things that's considered urgent and important today is inclusiveness. Now, your notion of reason comes largely from John Locke, who is a member of a group we could call the white male Europeans. Yes, I guess some people add the word dead to that.
The dead ones, yeah.
The dead ones. Now, is it fair to, is it wise to, or is it inclusive? I guess that's the real question. Is it inclusive if how can people who are not male or not descended from Europeans find themselves at home in your view of liberal education and rationality if your source is one of the famous white male Europeans? How would you if the um, if it's, is your notion of liberal education Eurocentric? That might be one way to put it. And if so, isn't that a problem?
Yeah, so I guess I have a couple of different things to say about that. And the first one is a little non-specific, but I want to mention it anyway, which is that although my book does argue for the inclusion of canonical, let's call them, figures like Locke in liberal education, I don't regard that as the whole of liberal education. And I think that my colleagues over in the natural sciences who aren't reading great books are engaged in the work of liberal education too, as are my social science colleagues next door who haven't cracked such a book for a long time. The cultivation of reason may require in some ways looking into old books because, as I mentioned, one of our deep prejudices is the prejudice of time. But the cultivation of reason isn't all reading great books, European or otherwise. But let me speak more specifically to the worry. At first, when I first hear it, I guess, and I've certainly heard it before, it's no objection. My first inclination is to be sort of dismissive. Oh, come on, right? Is the initial reaction. And the oh, come on comes from the idea that somehow or another, I've got a student, the 21st century, some white guy, who maybe looks like me. I'm pretty white. And then maybe I also have a Black woman in my class, right? And that one of them is closer to Socrates than another seems a little far-fetched to me. That is to say that they're both dealing with profoundly alien culture coming to them in translation. And I just don't think that, my typical first-year student, I'm not sure if any student comes, opens up the Republic and says, wow, yeah, this is me right here. Again, any more than a Black female student might. I could be wrong about that, but I've been teaching for quite a while, and that idea strikes me as a little bit far-fetched. But the typical defense one makes in these circumstances is to appeal to authors from outgroups, you might say, who say, I benefited a great deal from reading European authors who aren't merely European, but are speaking to profound human questions that I can recognize, even though I've somehow or another been put down, subordinated, excluded, erased, marginalized by that culture. But it gets tricky, right? So famously, W.E.B. Du Bois, the Black activist and social scientist and thinker and critic, writing in the early 20th century in the souls of Black folk, this line is often invoked, says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not, which means something like Shakespeare has universal appeal, whereas my white countrymen might wince a great deal as I walk by. Shakespeare doesn't. It's by communing with Shakespeare that I find myself above the veil, meaning the veil that otherwise separates Du Bois from the wider white-dominated culture that he sits in. On the other hand, people don't often go beyond the Shakespeare to notice that he pointedly includes Dumas among the authors that enable him to dwell above the veil. Dumas, whose grandparent, grandfather, I think, or grandmother, I forget, but one of his grandparents was a black slave, and Du Bois absolutely thinks to include him because he recognizes, as these objectors recognize, that the books we consider great, like everything else, really, right, that we think is good, is influenced by considerations other than reason, is influenced by who's up and who's down at any given moment. And so, it's not unreasonable to think that this thing I'm being presented with as a guide to greatness might be tainted, in some ways. And so you might want to attend to that. So, I think one should attend to that. I think it's reasonable to attend to that. And in that sense, I guess that I'd like to think the argument I'm making leaves room for critique, that is all-round evaluation of the canon that we've got, the list of great books. Not that we agree on all of them, but then that sort of list that we've got, which has changed over the course of time and is changing, even now. But, and again, this is the last thing I'll say about this particular objection. I do think that that same, white male 20-year-old student and the black female 20-year-old student, they're both closer to, right, a 20th century black author, 21st century black author like Toni Morrison than they are to anybody who wrote 200 years ago. So that, I think, is red herring, the idea that somehow or another students who are descended from Europeans, at least, I don't know, at least the United States, students who are descended from Europeans find themselves advantaged or can see themselves in this great books canon. That doesn't strike me as quite right. I don't think any of us are very, very good at seeing ourselves there because we're too narrow.
Here's another objection that has to do with, here's another objection to your argument about being reasonable. Earlier, you said that we can become reasonable by starting from what we know or what we think we know, and seeing where it gets us. Drawing inferences. That phrase, what we know, some people would say that this is always inevitably culturally conditioned, that if Locke wants to say, if Locke wants to say reason should be the authority, try to make reason your authority and not prejudice. Some people would argue that the distinction between what's reasonable and what's a prejudice will vary from society to society and from epoch to epoch, and what was considered to be rational, highly rational in one place in one time will be considered to be a terrible prejudice in another place in time. More generally, a lot of people today, as you know, are very skeptical about the ability of reason, whether Lockean or not, Lockean or Socratic or Rousseauan, to transcend the limits of culture, let's say, and to actually arrive at plausible conclusions about what's good and bad, right and wrong, what is the good society. These things are always, we can never fully escape our own culturally imbued presuppositions.
So you're asking what I would say to that objection.
What's your response to that objection?
Yeah, I like to start all my responses with, "Oh, come on." But let me elaborate. So I'm not sure anyone acts as if they believe that. I'm persuaded in a lot of ways by, even though, it's a book that's now, I don't know, 35 years old, something like that now. Wow, a long time. The Closing of the American Mind, in which Alan Bloom argues that kind of objection is an objection motivated by an implicit understanding of what's reasonable. That is to say, that it's unreasonable to be inegalitarian, to think you're better than anybody else, and reasonable to be egalitarian. So that the objection is raised in large part to undermine the notion that one culture, but particularly Western culture, might be better than any other culture. So at the back of the objection, I think, is nearly always, maybe always, but certainly nearly always, some underlying and very strongly held view about what's reasonable, what's just, what's good. Now, I think it's obviously true, or often true, that when, and this goes all the way back to, and I'm sure before Plato's Republic, but I teach Plato's Republic from time to time, so it's fresh in my mind, that what passes for justice in most times and places is what one character in that dialogue calls the advantage of the stronger. In other words, the reigning ideas about justice serve somebody most of the time. And the same thing could be said of reason, right? I mean, who deny that maybe more than half the time when somebody says be reasonable, what they actually mean is shut up? And that's true of notions about civility as well, right? When I say be civil, I often mean pipe down, right? Or something like that. So I think it's plainly true, and therefore worth entertaining the idea that behind any given presentation of what reason is, there's a fist. But it's a big leap from there to the conclusion that, well, therefore there is no civility, there is no such thing as justice, and there is no such thing as reason. And like I said, the objection is almost always based on some implicit idea of what those things are. In other words, some objection to the reigning ideas that are out there, and some notion that's unfair and unreasonable for those ideas to prevail just because somebody has more power than somebody else. Now, that's sort of a school child objection, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious, but I also think that that's pretty damaging. Now, what about the idea that behind any given philosophy, that there's power, right? So this idea that you can find certainly before Nietzsche, but I'd say that certainly a lot of people are drawing in the end on Nietzsche when they make that kind of argument. I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, the first thing I'd say is just some version of the of the first objection I just raised, that people don't seem to really think of that or to live as if that's true. But then also, I don't think that it's the main obstacle, at least among my students, to the idea of being reasonable. It's more, I mean, I think most of my students would say, yes, I want to be reasonable. That's they may not put in those abstract terms, but they're quite interested, and tried to figure out things like how can I help my friend right now, right, on some basis other than coin flips or appealing to some authority who might know, or something like that. But that they doubt that it's possible, right? They think, well, in mathematics, it seems like we can reason our way to conclusions. In the sciences, it appears that, we do some reasoning and suddenly we've got a rocket. That's pretty great. Or, a can opener. And so those are models for what reasoning looks like. And I think that my students simply have trouble imagining what it might look like in contexts in which, even after you've done all of your reasoning, probably reasonable people are going to continue to disagree about the matter at hand. I mean, it's true, as Locke says, there are probably instances in which you've got, so to speak, plain reason and the conviction of clear arguments where it really does churn out an answer that if you're denying it, it's probably because you're not really thinking. But not all of the questions one looks at are like that. And we know things to different degrees.
Jonathan, a final question, and I think this is one to which you won't be able to say, come on. I think. You have almost admitted you have almost confessed to being a member of the John Locke fan club. By the way, I want to be a member too of this club. But I think he's not the only fan club that you're a member of. For all your admiration of Locke, you do say in the book that his notions of reason and education might be somehow defective. They might be missing something, as great as he was. And we could recall that you're also the author of a book on Rousseau. What might be wrong or limited about Locke?
Well, you're right. I can't say I'll come on to that. Yeah, so I think I can do this in 2 minutes or less, or at least point at it.
You can have more than 2 minutes.
And I write about it in my book too. So there's always that for those who hunger for more. But the one of the most striking things, I think, in reading Locke after you've read Rousseau. So Rousseau has this wonderful book on education in a lot of ways called Emile. And so Locke, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which is in many ways Emile is a rival to that book. Rousseau wrote Emile, I think it's clear, with Locke by his side, so to speak, at least when he was revising the manuscript. So we know that he had some thoughts concerning education in front of him, and he refers to it in his thinking about it. And Some Thoughts Concerning Education, it ends with the pupil one is educating ready to get married. And Locke basically says, well, all right, he's ready to get married. That's it. That's all, folks, right? And in Emile, on the other hand, right, the move from the adolescent fire, this expansiveness, right, of adolescence, the move from that, right, to marriage, requiring kind of education in love and an acquaintance with the beautiful, according to Rousseau, that occupies a great deal of the book. It's just absent, in Locke, as far as I can tell. And those passions are important, right? So, one of the things I regard as a great strength of Locke is that he really does appeal to a utilitarianism, right? A sense that we really need something useful that I think is really American and democratic. And in a way, I think if you were to present, if I were talking to a group of potential students, so I'm sometimes called upon to do, we have to get butts in those chairs. And I were to say, well, the reason you should pursue a liberal education is to satisfy your erotic longing, right? You think you want sex, but actually you want philosophy, right? I think those students would probably think, most of them, what a sicko. What's wrong with that guy? But I think there is something to the proposition, right? That as Locke also knew, right? I mean, he does talk about people devoted to study, right? As if that's an aim in itself. But Locke is quite helpful because I think that he does explain in a way to somebody who has no other concerns, or at the forefront of mind, why you might want a liberal education, right? One of the answers is just, if you don't have one, you're going to end up doing sort of, pretty stupid things, regardless of what your field of endeavor is, right? So somebody who is determined to be an engineer, right, knows that, right, from age 6, right? Locke can still talk to such a person and explain why a liberal education might be important, but there's this other piece of human experience, which may not be altogether antithetical to rationality, which has to be reckoned with, right? That I don't see, and that partly explains the appeal of liberal education, maybe, that Locke doesn't deal with much, if at all. So I think that's a defect. That's a product defect. I want my money back.
All right, so the next step then for viewers of this video, those brave souls who watch it to the end, would be, number one, read Let's Be Reasonable by Jonathan Marks, and then go on to Some Thoughts Concerning Education by John Locke, and then Rousseau's A Meal. That might be a good start, some good next steps. Would you agree?
I think, I love the first step for obvious reasons, but I think all 3 steps, that would be a wonderful way of pursuing some of the questions that we've been talking about in this conversation, which may seem long to some, but I consider too brief.
Well, so do I. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us. We enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, David. So did I.